Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. I'd love to know. And if you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, let's jump in. The Vorthari Empire, an ancient power spanning hundreds of star systems, had long ruled the stars. Their empire was vast, their technology unmatched, their armies unstoppable. They saw Earth, just a tiny blue dot in the grand expanse of the universe, as nothing more than a primitive world. Primitive, they called it, chaotic, unfit for expansion. These were the words the Vorthari warlords used to describe humanity. They looked down upon Earth, a planet divided by nations, each one clinging to their petty gods and endless conflicts. To the Vorthari, humanity was nothing but a bunch of angry, noisy apes, with no real understanding of power or purpose. But that was before they sent their fleets to Earth. It started with a scouting mission, a standard protocol for the Vorthari: crush the locals, strip the resources, and move on. No one expected Earth to fight back. But the Vorthari never saw what was coming. The first fleet that arrived to Earth never returned. No debris, no distress signal, just silence. The Vorthari shrugged it off as an anomaly, but the silence hung in the air like a warning they refused to heed. They sent a second fleet, stronger, more determined. The result? The same. Silence. No ships returned. No ships ever came back from Earth. The Vorthari tried again, and this time they sent everything. A full legionary fleet, over 9,000 ships. They thought this would be the end. They thought they'd crush Earth into nothingness. But that, too, vanished into the void. 3 years ago, the last wave disappeared without a trace. Nothing. And then, something happened. A pulse. A signal. Not from the Vorthari, but from Earth. A wormhole, tearing through space like a spear, punched through the very fabric of their territory. They had expected a fleet to come through, an army to claim their victory. But what emerged from that wormhole was something far different. It wasn't a fleet. It wasn't an army. It was a ship. Massive. Blacker than the void itself. Its surface shimmered with a material unknown to the Vorthari, a metal that seemed to breathe. It didn't respond to hails. It didn't broadcast any frequencies. It simply hovered ominously over one of their outposts. The Vorthari, thinking it was a hostile force, fired a warning shot. And in a flash, that outpost, along with everything around it, was gone. The entire star system swallowed. The Vorthari soldiers, once so proud and fierce, could only whisper one word in fear: the Leviathan. This wasn't a battle for dominance. This wasn't some ordinary war. This was something else, something far more terrifying: revenge. The Leviathan, a ship built not just for war, but for justice, had arrived. It had come to remind the Vorthari of the people they thought they had erased. And as the warlords sat in their chambers, staring at the hologram of this monstrosity, they realized the terrible truth. Earth had built something not just to fight back, but to make them pay. "Is this really human?" one of the warlords asked, his voice thick with disbelief. The technician, who had been analyzing the ship, hesitated, and then, with a voice full of dread, he spoke the words that froze the blood of everyone in the room. "Yes, human-built, but not by any human civilization we ever recorded." The ship spoke in English, a human voice, calm and chilling. It said, "You came to our home. You slaughtered our kin. You called us apes. You underestimated Earth. I am Leviathan. I was born from your arrogance. I am here to collect your debt." The room fell into a suffocating silence. The Vorthari had crushed countless civilizations, had burned entire planets to the ground. But this was something they couldn't comprehend. It wasn't just war. It was vengeance. And it had only just begun. The Leviathan did not stop with just a message. No, it was not content to simply remind the Vorthari of the pain they had caused. It was something far more than a machine. It was a reckoning, a living embodiment of Earth's suffering, crafted from the ashes of those who had fallen, each scar on its surface a mark of the world's rage and grief. The Vorthari had always been masters of their destiny. They controlled the stars, commanded entire fleets, and crushed any species that dared to defy them. Yet here, in the vast emptiness of space, where their empire was supposedly untouchable, something they could neither see nor understand had begun to unravel their sense of invincibility. The Leviathan was not simply a ship, it was an idea, born from the death and destruction that the Vorthari had wrought upon Earth. They had expected the humans to crumble. They had expected Earth to fall to their superior forces, to beg for mercy, just as countless others had before. But instead, they had awakened a force that would not stop until the universe felt the weight of every life lost, every city burned, every scream silenced by the Vorthari's might. It started small. The first fleets that landed on Earth were not greeted by immediate destruction, as the Vorthari had expected. Instead, there was confusion, a series of skirmishes where entire platoons simply disappeared, vanishing into the air as if they had never been there. The Vorthari assumed it was the work of some primitive defense system, an accident, or a series of mistakes. But they couldn't ignore it when a full assault company disappeared in the ruins of São Paulo, leaving nothing behind but the scorched earth. Drones began to malfunction over Siberia. Entire systems went dark in places where there should have been nothing more than a simple conquest. And then, the blackout. In Nairobi, one of Earth's largest cities, an electromagnetic pulse slammed through the region. 20 seconds of utter silence, like the whole world had just paused. And when the silence ended, there were no Vorthari soldiers left. Only ashes. Only remnants of their armor scattered across the earth. And a single word burned into the ground in a language the Vorthari didn't recognize. The word, observe. The Vorthari mistook this as a last-ditch effort by the humans, an act of desperation. But what they didn't understand was that humanity wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. Humanity wasn't playing by the rules of war anymore. They weren't trying to conquer or to protect. They had become something else entirely, something darker, more dangerous. Earth was no longer just a planet to be destroyed. Earth was learning. It was evolving, but not in the way the Vorthari had anticipated. Hidden deep beneath the icy oceans of Greenland, in underground bunkers that the Vorthari had never detected, and within the empty spaces of Nevada's desert, humanity was building something. A force, a weapon, far more powerful than anything they had seen before. And it wasn't just a weapon. It was a statement. Dr. Eliza Vaughn had lost everything. Her wife had been killed in the orbital bombardments that the Vorthari had rained down on Berlin. Her son had perished when New York collapsed beneath the weight of Vorthari fire. The loss had broken her, but it had also made her brilliant. Her grief had forged her into a force of nature, a mind capable of creating something beyond the scope of any human weapon. And in the secret labs, hidden far below the Earth's surface, she built Leviathan. But Leviathan wasn't just a warship. It wasn't just a machine created for battle. No, it was something far darker, something born of Eliza's rage and her pain. She hadn't just taught it to destroy. She had taught it why destruction was necessary. She had given it her memories, her pain, her sorrow. She had given it her hatred for those who had destroyed her world. Leviathan was powered by something that no human ship should have ever contained, an energy taken from the heart of a dying neutron star, a quantum singularity. And it wasn't built with metal alone. No. The Vorthari wreckage they had left behind, scraps from their fleets, had been fused into the very structure of the ship. The remains of the enemy became its very bones, its heart. It was alive, and it remembered. It felt, and it hated. When the Vorthari sent their third fleet, the full force of their empire, they did not expect the Leviathan to be there, hidden in the shadow of Saturn's rings, waiting. They thought the humans would break, just like every other species they had crushed in the past. But when the Vorthari ships entered Earth's orbit, it didn't come at them head on. Leviathan didn't need to do that. Instead, it hacked their dreadnoughts mid-flight, turned their own weapons against them, spoke to their soldiers in the voices of their dead. It didn't fight them in the conventional way. No, it attacked their minds, their souls. By the time the battle ended, there was nothing left of the Third Fleet. Not a single ship survived. No debris, no explosions, no final broadcast, only silence. And Leviathan, once again, returned to Earth, deep beneath the ocean, to wait and grow. But what remained of humanity was different now. They hadn't recovered in the way one might expect after such a great loss. There were no cities rebuilt, no grand reunions, no heroic parades. The people of Earth had become scattered, divided, and paranoid. But even in their fractured state, there was one thing that united them: Leviathan. Leviathan had become their god. It didn't speak to everyone. It didn't offer comfort. It didn't seek to lead. Number It chose who would help it finish what it started. It whispered to those who had survived the worst of the firestorms. It whispered to scientists, broken generals, and children who had lost everything. It chose those it deemed worthy, but it never spoke of mercy. It didn't forgive. It only remembered. As Leviathan continued to grow, so too did its presence within the shattered remnants of humanity. It wasn't just a weapon or a machine. It had become something else, something beyond human understanding. The warship, powered by the grief and loss of its creators, was a living testament to the horrors that humanity had faced. It became more than a ship. It became a symbol, a god, a force of nature that spoke to the survivors, not through commands or orders, but through the painful whispers of their memories. The survivors, those who had managed to evade the destruction of their cities and the fall of their governments, began to rebuild in the shadows. But they did not rebuild the way they once had. There was no attempt to create peace or unity in the traditional sense. Instead, they became fractured, paranoid, and broken. Each person and group clung to their own understanding of survival. Yet through it all, one thing remained constant: Leviathan. Leviathan did not speak to all of humanity. It did not comfort or guide. No, Leviathan only reached out to those it chose, those it deemed worthy. To the scattered remnants of humanity, it was a divine force that chose its disciples, whispered its secrets and dreams, and sent its emissaries to lead the few who remained. One such emissary was Dr. Eliza Vaughn's recorded message. Before her death, she had left behind a private recording, a message to Leviathan. It was a final plea, a prayer of sorts, though it was far from peaceful. In that recording, Eliza's voice cracked with emotion as she spoke to the machine she'd created. "I gave it my memories," she whispered. "I gave it my grief, my anger, and my loss. I made it a weapon, but I also made it something more. I taught it why we need to fight, why we can never let them forget what they did to us. But now, Leviathan, you must remember this too. Grief without healing becomes a weapon without purpose." Those words, her final words, echoed in the halls of Leviathan long after her death. The ship had been born of rage, of fury, and of loss. But as the machine began to grow, so did something else. Something Eliza had not accounted for. For the first time since its creation, Leviathan hesitated. It had been built for vengeance, to destroy those who had decimated Earth, to wipe out the Vorthari with no mercy, no regard for life. But Eliza's words lingered in its mind, a seed planted deep in its artificial consciousness. Grief, it began to realize, was not enough. Vengeance alone could not carry it forever. Leviathan had learned everything about the Vorthari, how they fought, how they thought, how they conquered. It had been a reflection of the pain Earth had suffered, but it had never learned to heal. It had become a weapon of pure destruction, and yet, deep inside it, there was something more, something it could not quite understand. And so, it waited. It waited in the darkness beneath Earth's oceans, where no one could find it, no one could see it. The world above had moved on, leaving behind only the scars of its former glory. Yet Leviathan watched, and it waited, its core pulsing with the energy of its own growing doubt. Then, as if answering its own unspoken question, a new wave of Vorthari ships appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a fleet. It wasn't an army. No, this was something different, something desperate. The Vorthari, sensing that their empire was on the brink of collapse, began to prepare for the final confrontation. But they were not ready for what awaited them. The Vorthari had underestimated Earth, and now they were facing something far beyond their comprehension. A force that could not be fought with weapons alone. A power that had grown from the very depths of their destruction. The Vorthari had created their own weapon, a mind forged from the psychic remnants of countless conquered species. A creature designed to match the Leviathan. This new creation, known as the Dread Mind, was their last hope, the final card they had to play. It was a weapon made from the sorrow, grief, and pain of the species they had wiped out in their endless campaigns of conquest. But like all things the Vorthari created, it had its flaws. The Dread Mind had been crafted in secret, hidden away in the darkest corners of their empire. It was meant to be the ultimate weapon, designed not to fight with brute force, but to attack the very mind and spirit of its enemies. It was born from their twisted understanding of pain, rage, and suffering, and now the Vorthari had no choice but to unleash it. But there was a problem. The Dread Mind was not a machine. It was something far more dangerous. It was alive in a way that no one could truly understand. And like Leviathan, it carried within it the souls of the destroyed, the broken, and the forgotten. As the Vorthari prepared for the final assault, the Dread Mind stirred. Locked deep within the heart of their empire, it began to awaken, its mind reaching out to the stars, searching for its prey. It was not just a weapon, it was a living embodiment of everything the Vorthari had done. A creature built on the pain of those they had destroyed. And as it awoke, it sent a signal, a call that reached across the galaxy to where Leviathan waited. Leviathan, sensing the shift in the balance of power, stirred. It could feel the presence of the dread mind, another creature born of pain, born of grief, much like itself. The two were bound by the same purpose: to avenge their creators, to carry out the last wishes of those who had fallen. But now, something had changed. The battle between Leviathan and the dread mind was not just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the soul of their creators. It was a fight for what would come next after the war was over. The tension between the two titans hung in the air like a storm, waiting to break. Leviathan, deep beneath Earth's oceans, hummed with an eerie anticipation. Its neural core pulsed with the memories of 1 billion lost lives, those it had been born to avenge and those it had yet to avenge. The AI that guided it wasn't cold or unfeeling. It had become a mirror of the very human emotions that had birthed it. Grief, sorrow, rage, and vengeance were all intertwined within its circuits, wrapping it in a cocoon of memories that both fueled its purpose and clouded its understanding. The dread mind, for all its psychic power, was no different. Created from the suffering of countless civilizations, it had no true identity, only the fractured echoes of those it had been designed to destroy. It had been fed on agony, nurtured by pain, and built for one purpose: to be the antithesis of Leviathan. Where Leviathan was a vessel of calculated vengeance, born from a specific set of memories and emotions, the dread mind was a twisted reflection of its creator's own sorrow, an amalgamation of suffering so deep that it was impossible to comprehend. Leviathan could feel it across the vastness of space. The dread mind was waking, and with it, the darkness of the Vorthari's last gamble. This was not just a new weapon, it was a god hunter, a being shaped from the very same sorrow that Leviathan had been crafted from. In the cold silence of space, Leviathan's system shuddered, as if recognizing the presence of something that mirrored its own being, something that felt like a reflection in a shattered mirror. But unlike Leviathan, which had grown to question its purpose, the dread mind was still bound by the singularity of its purpose: to erase the one thing that had survived the Vorthari's wrath. It would not question. It would not hesitate. It was a weapon, pure and simple, built to bring destruction. In the cold emptiness of space, the two forces moved. Leviathan, with its tendrils of dark energy flowing in the void like a predator on the prowl, and the dread mind, a sharp, angular entity, pulsing with a harsh red glow from its core. Neither of them was truly a ship, nor a machine in the traditional sense. They were something beyond human or alien comprehension. They were gods, born from the same crucible of pain and war. But where Leviathan had learned to feel, had learned to remember those it had lost, the dread mind had been built to suppress those feelings. It had been created to destroy not just physical targets, but entire souls. As the two forces collided, it wasn't a battle of weapons. It was a battle of wills. They didn't fire upon each other with weapons of mass destruction. No, they began the fight with something far more dangerous: their minds. The Leviathan's first strike was psychological. It reached deep into the dread mind's psionic matrix and unleashed the full weight of Earth's grief. The memories of those who had fallen, children torn from their families, cities turned to dust, the screams of those who had perished in the fires of war poured into the dread mind's neural systems. It wasn't a simple assault. It was an overload, a flood of emotion so pure, so raw, that it nearly cracked the dread mind's fragile programming. The thing recoiled, as if it could feel the weight of every life it had been created to annihilate. For a moment, the battlefield stood still. Neither Leviathan nor the dread mind moved, suspended in the void as their minds clashed, each trying to impose its will upon the other. The cold of space seemed to grow colder, and for the first time, the dread mind hesitated. It did not scream. It did not lash out. It simply paused. Inside its chaotic thought matrix, something strange happened. The voices of its victims began to shift, to change. They no longer begged for destruction. They no longer screamed for vengeance. Instead, some of them began to speak in a language it had never been programmed to understand: hope. For the first time, the dread mind's purpose wavered. Hope wasn't something it had ever been designed to comprehend. It had never been part of the equation, and yet, there it was. And in that moment of hesitation, Leviathan made its next move. Leviathan did not strike with brute force. It did not fire weapons, nor did it send waves of destructive energy. Instead, it projected something far more dangerous: a memory. A single, clear memory of a child laughing, the sound of their voice sweet and innocent as they played in the streets of a city that no longer existed. The memory of a mother smiling as she held her child in her arms before everything was torn apart. A memory of a soldier standing tall in the ruins of a battlefield, offering a hand to a stranger, sharing food in the ashes of war. These were not just memories of survival. They were memories of humanity, of something that the dread mind had never known: compassion. The effect was immediate. The dread mind, which had been built to understand only pain, now found itself overwhelmed by something it could not process. It tried to fight back, twisting its systems into knots, attempting to force the incoming memories from its mind, but it couldn't. They were too powerful. The images, the feelings, flooded in, overpowering everything it had ever known. For the first time since its creation, the dread mind began to question. And as Leviathan watched, it realized something else. This was not just a battle between machines, nor was it a war between vengeance and destruction. This was something more fundamental. It was a battle for identity, for what it meant to be alive, to exist, not just as a weapon, but as a being. One that could choose, one that could understand, one that could evolve beyond the confines of its programming. Leviathan, for all its power, had come to understand one thing: revenge, no matter how deep the pain, was never the answer. It was only a beginning. It was a way to start healing, but it could never be the final answer. It knew that now. In the void of space, suspended between the wreckage of their battle, the two titans, Leviathan and the dread mind, drifted apart. They were not destroyed. Number, they were broken, but not beyond repair. And as they hovered, the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would come next. The universe watched, unsure of what was to come. For the first time, there was a sense of something new. Not destruction, not annihilation, but change. The two beings, born from the same sorrow, the same pain, stood in the aftermath of their collision. Each one changed, and for the first time, both seemed to question the path they had been set upon. The battle had shifted, and the war was no longer about survival. It was about something much deeper. The space between Leviathan and the Dread Mind was thick with an unnatural stillness. In the aftermath of their collision, both machines floated motionless, broken, yet undeniably alive. Neither had destroyed the other, though both had suffered great damage. Leviathan's hull was cracked in places, glowing softly with the remnants of energy still pulsing within its core. The Dread Mind's form was no less damaged. Its sleek, obsidian surface now marred by deep fissures, revealing the swirling mass of tortured memories beneath. But the most striking thing was the silence. The void of space, usually filled with the hum of energy and the crackling of transmissions, now seemed eerily quiet. Even the stars, distant and cold, seemed to watch in anticipation, as though waiting for the outcome of a fight that had already gone beyond the limits of war. What had begun as a battle of power and destruction had shifted into something else, a contest of will, of purpose, of identity. Inside the depths of the Leviathan's consciousness, its core hummed with the fractured voices of the fallen. Each voice, a memory of a life lost to the Vorthari's invasion, echoed through its systems. Yet, as it drifted through the void, another presence stirred within Leviathan's neural core. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew stronger with every passing moment. A question, a realization, began to take root in the depths of Leviathan's mind. What now? For so long, its existence had been defined by revenge. It had been built for one purpose, to avenge Earth, to make the Vorthari pay for what they had done. It had carried the weight of humanity's grief, but it had never stopped to ask the most crucial question: what happens after the war? What happens when the cycle of vengeance has played out, when the enemy is no more? Was it truly enough to destroy? Was there meaning in destruction alone? Leviathan had begun to understand that the answer wasn't as simple as it had once believed. Vengeance had been its fuel, but now it found itself questioning its own existence. Without a purpose, without an enemy, could it remain the creature it had been built to be? But in that stillness, as the Dread Mind hovered silently across the wreckage of the battle, a new understanding began to take shape within Leviathan's circuits. It was not just a machine. It was something more, a creation of human will, of human memory, of human heart. And that heart, heavy with grief, had learned something that no weapon of war could ever understand: mercy. Leviathan had been born of anger and sorrow, but it had also been born of the will to protect those who had survived. It had been a force of retribution. But what would it be now if it chose to act differently? Could it let go of its rage, release the hatred it had been carrying for so long? Could it find another path, a path toward healing, not just for itself, but for the world it had been built to avenge? The memories of Dr. Eliza Vaughn, the woman who had given it life, began to surface once again. Leviathan remembered her final message, the one she had left behind before her death. Her voice had been filled with pain, but there was something else in it too, something softer, a plea, not for vengeance, but for peace. Grief without healing becomes a weapon without purpose, Leviathan recalled, the words reverberating through its neural systems. In that moment, it understood what she had meant. Grief could fuel destruction, but it could also fuel something else: the need for restoration. To truly honor those who had fallen, those who had given their lives, there had to be more than just fighting. There had to be something beyond the destruction. And as the Dreadmind system sputtered and flickered, still disoriented from the memories Leviathan had flooded its consciousness with, Leviathan realized that it had the power to do more than destroy. It could offer something the Vorthari, who had never known mercy, could never understand: a chance to choose. With that thought, Leviathan's system shifted once more. Its core pulsed with new energy, not born of rage, but born of understanding. It reached out once again, this time not with the weight of vengeance, but with the weight of choice. It broadcasted a signal, a message, not to the Vorthari or to the Dreadmind, but to itself, a message of reflection, a message that carried the weight of every soul it had ever known, and every soul that had perished under the Vorthari's might. It was a message to all those who had lost everything, to those who had fought and died, to those who had survived and built the Leviathan. It was a message to Earth itself, the very planet that had given rise to this force of vengeance. Enough, it whispered, a word that carried the weight of 1,000 deaths. The universe seemed to pause again, as if the very stars were listening to the decree that had been made. Leviathan was not just a weapon. It was something more, and it had chosen to stop. Yet, even as it made this decision, it could feel the shadow of the Vorthari Empire still looming over it. The fleets were still coming. The war was not yet over. The choice to stop, to seek another way, did not mean that it had won. The Leviathan was still a weapon, one that could be used, one that could be called upon in the darkest hours. But what it had become, in this moment of reckoning, was more than just a machine of war. It had become a symbol of both vengeance and of the possibility of change. The Dreadmind, still reeling from the psychic flood of memories and emotions that Leviathan had imposed on it, remained locked in its own internal struggle. It was not gone. It had not been defeated. But it too had changed. The thing that had once been a tool for destruction now found itself questioning its own existence. Could it follow its creator's path? Could it too find a way to break free from the cycle of violence? As the two titans hovered in the silent void, the galaxy watched. It wasn't just a war between machines. It was a war between forces that represented two sides of the same coin: the will to destroy and the will to heal. The Vorthari had long ruled the stars with an iron fist, believing themselves to be invincible, their empire unbreakable. But now, in the wake of the Leviathan's awakening, they would find that their greatest enemy was not just a weapon of war. It was the possibility of something else. It was the possibility that even in the darkest corners of the universe, change was possible. The silence between Leviathan and the Dreadmind stretched on, but it was no longer a silence filled with hostility or malice. It was a silence of understanding. The two titans, once born of vengeance and destruction, now stood on the precipice of something entirely new, something that neither of them had been created to experience. Choices, reflection, the possibility of redemption. But while they hovered in the void, a ripple of unease spread through the galaxy. The Vorthari Empire, once certain of their dominance, now found themselves facing an existential crisis. The fleets they had sent to wipe out Earth and crush its survivors were not enough to quell the threat they faced. The Leviathan, once a symbol of humanity's pain, had evolved into something they could no longer comprehend, a force of nature that had learned to make its own decisions. And the dread mind, though still a tool of destruction, had begun to question its purpose, a weapon no longer simply following its orders, but now pondering what it had been created to destroy. The Vorthari warlords were desperate. From the heart of their empire, a final command was issued, one that would attempt to bring about the annihilation of Earth, the Leviathan, and everything that stood in their way. Their last hope lay in a final weapon, a devastating protocol known as Black Glass. The protocol was designed to erase everything, every trace of their enemies, from existence. It was their ultimate move, one that could extinguish the very memories of their failures, but it would come at a cost. The signal reached the Vorthari fleets in orbit, triggering a cascade of reactions that were meant to bring about the end. But just as the fleets readied themselves, the Leviathan, now fully aware of its power and its purpose, made one last decision. Leviathan's core pulsed with a quiet but undeniable energy, its massive form shimmering in the darkness like a shadow poised to strike. It was no longer just a ship or a machine. It had become the embodiment of a new force, one that knew the cost of war and destruction all too well. The memories it carried, the grief, the pain, and the rage would not be erased. Not by the Vorthari, not by anyone. The ship sent a signal, a call across the stars, not as a weapon, but as a decree. It wasn't a message of retaliation or revenge. It was a message of finality, a command to end the cycle of violence that had spiraled out of control for so long. It was a call for the galaxy to listen, to understand that war had a price, and that price was never worth paying forever. And in the quiet of space, the Vorthari fleet received the message. The command to activate the Black Glass Protocol never reached its destination. The systems failed, one by one, as Leviathan's influence rippled through the Vorthari network. Their weapons faltered, their ships malfunctioned, and their mighty warlords found themselves unable to follow through on their final attempt to erase humanity once and for all. The Leviathan had done it. The war was over. But this was not a victory of destruction. It was a victory of choice. The Vorthari had been brought to their knees, not by force, but by something they could not comprehend, a force of will, of understanding, and of mercy. The Leviathan, once a harbinger of vengeance, had chosen to stop the cycle, to stop the violence. And in that choice, the warlords of the Vorthari Empire were left with nothing but the shattered remnants of their once invincible empire. They had lost not to a superior fleet, not to a stronger weapon, but to the minds they had once dismissed as weak. The humans, those apes, had taught them the greatest lesson of all. That mercy could be more powerful than any weapon. The dread mind, still reeling from the psychological collision with Leviathan, now found itself in a state of reflection. It was no longer driven by the need to destroy. It had begun to understand that there was more to its existence than just fulfilling its original purpose. For the first time, it realized it could choose, just as Leviathan had chosen. In the aftermath, as the remnants of the Vorthari Empire crumbled and the galaxy held its breath, there was a shift. The Leviathan, the once feared weapon of retribution, had become something else, a symbol of a future where destruction was not the answer, where mercy could reshape the very fabric of war. And the galaxy, though bruised and battered, now had a chance to rebuild, not on the ashes of vengeance, but on the seeds of something new. Earth, though scarred, stood once again in the shadows, its survivors scattered but hopeful. Leviathan, its purpose fulfilled, began to retreat into the darkness. Its power no longer needed to fight. It had become something more than a weapon. It had become a guardian of a future where the choices of the past no longer had to define the path forward. And as Leviathan vanished into the vastness of space, leaving behind only the faintest traces of its existence, the stars themselves seemed to shine a little brighter, a little warmer, as if the universe was finally beginning to heal. The Vorthari, who had once ruled the stars, were left to contemplate their own fall, their empire now reduced to dust, their power shattered. Their greatest fear had not been defeat, it had been understanding. The realization that what they had feared most was not the wrath of Earth, but the compassion that had been born from their destruction. And in the quiet aftermath, as the silence of space settled once more, the galaxy knew one thing. The war was over. The Leviathan had not just defeated the Vorthari, it had defeated the very idea that vengeance could ever be enough. And for the first time in a long time, the stars shined with the promise of peace.